Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Barev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fivcha beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן.
אמן.
All right, guys, we're going to start with the Mishnah Brura quickly. So, Rabbi Daniel Brody, benching that covers wine and who drinks the Kiddush wine. So, we learned that to be definitely obligated in an after bracha on drinks, you must make sure you drink more than a revi'i of liquid, and that's 86 milliliters. Or drink less than 27 milliliters to avoid the after bracha entirely. So between 27 and 86 is the safek. So either drink less or drink more, at which you're either not obligated at all or definitely obligated. And this applies to wine or any other drink, actually, for that matter. So since Kiddush requires a drinking of at least a cheekful, which is 45 milliliters, one should drink a revi'i just to be sure, so that you have a definite obligation in after bracha. So it's important to note that one needs to be careful only when the Kiddush won't be followed by a bread meal. In that case, the after bracha bikata mazon on the bread will anyway cover any amount of wine too. So we're saying this is only a case where you're doing, for example, Kiddush where there's mazonot. In that particular case, you would need to be careful, but you don't need to be careful if you only having the 45 ml with Bikata Mazon, because it would cover it naturally when we benches and after bracha. So for example, on a Friday night, we all make Kiddush and then we have a bread meal. So there's no issue of having to drink up to a revi'i, since the benching at the end of the meal of the bread will anyway cover it. But if one at a shul does Kiddush on Shabbos morning, where one will just have a little bit of cake or other mezonot afterwards, and it's not actual bread itself, it presents a problem for whomever actually drinks the wine. So either drink very little to avoid an after bracha, or a very lot to be obligated in an after bracha. My question obviously on this is if you have to do an after bracha for mezonot, you do have that mezonot with that wine option in any event. Okay. So the rules of how much to drink in order to be obligated in an after bracha apply to anyone who drinks, irrespective of making or hearing the Kiddush. Okay, and where's this found? In the Mishnah Brura and Shulchan Aruch, in the Mishnah Brura, section 271, and in the Shulchan Aruch, section 174. All right, so now what's going to happen is we're going to we're virtually hitting a new part of the daf. We did hit daf number 23 on Friday and Thursday, because what actually came about was very, very simple. And that is, according to Reish Lakish, who deems fire to be one's property, but not one's arrows, one who set a fire and allows it to spread and injure a person who couldn't escape it, and just say it didn't kill the person, he only pays for bodily damage. Why? Since it's considered his property. So it's no different, for example, to having, according to Reish Lakish, an ox, that if it gores somebody, that you pay for the bodily damage. The full bodily damage in that case, because it's deemed, fire is deemed property just as an ox. But according to Rav Yochanan, fire, in addition to being one's property, is also deemed one's arrows. So what does this mean? It's the equivalent of one's force. So if Jew A hits Jew B, then you're liable for 4 other damages. That is the nezek shalem, the actual damage. In addition to that, you've got the damages of suffering, healing, and unemployment, in addition to the bodily damage. Now, when A hits B, you have the added factor of humiliation. Why? Because there is intent to damage. So the minute there's intent to damage, then you have to pay for that embarrassment. But nobody intends generally to set a fire, cause damage to their own property as well as to somebody else's property. Therefore, there is obviously a little bit of embarrassment because the person is disfigured, but it's only if the person, the perpetrator, is actually having an intention to injure or kill, like a Hitsby. So then humiliation is paid, but in every other case, you would pay for the actual nezik damage, actual damages, as well as the suffering, which is the pain, the healing, the refuah, medical bills, and the unemployment. So those are the three other damages. So that's how we ended off. And obviously, Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan end off on saying something even more, that if there's a case of murder, according to Reish Lakish, there would have to be the fire that you're setting the person actually alight. It uses an example of a Canaanite slave, at which Rav Yochanan would deem it's a person's arrows, which means that if you set a haystack alight and the person was unable to get away like a Canaanite slave, you're liable for the death penalty because you killed a human being through your force, through your arrows, because a person wasn't able to escape. Whereas Reish Lakish very clearly says it's deemed once somebody's property. So if it's somebody's property, that fire is your property and it kills somebody, and it's a Canaanite slave, just like if your ox kills a Canaanite slave, it's 30 silver shekels. If you set the fire to the slave directly, to his bodily person, it's considered an act of murder. So it has some real implication differences. So we're ending on that note. I hope I've made the previous stuff quite clear. And we're going to hit the new issue now. Kevin, I want to thank you for doing over the weekend the Chazorah on Friday afternoon. I appreciate that very much because now you're up to speed. It is appreciated, really. And we're dealing with a new issue now, and that issue is as follows, is that the Gemara discusses the next section of the Mishnah, which states, for the biscuit, he pays full damages, and for the stack, he pays half the damage. All right. So the Gemara asks, whom does the Mishnah make liable to pay for the stack? The master of the dog. Accordingly, the Gemara asks, but let the owner of the coal be liable to pay for the stack as well, because he left his coal where the dog could get at it. So now what we're dealing with is we're dealing with an issue of saying, well, actually, who is culpable? Gav, I want to now discuss the section of the Mishnah that states for the biscuit he pays full damages and for the stack he pays half damages. So the Gemara explains, who does the Mishnah make liable to pay for the stack? And that's the master of the dog. Accordingly, the Gemara asks, but let the owner of the coal be liable to pay for the stack as well, because he has left his coal where the dog could get at it. So what I'm saying here basically is as follows, is that we learned last time something quite interesting, is that Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish actually agree that to a certain extent, it's not just the dog's arrows, that it would deem that whoever owns the coal has ostensibly caused from the fire, because it ended off a last stuff with proving about hidden things and revealed things, that Rav Yochanan has to come to the conclusion that fire, in addition to being one's arrows, is one's property. So now it comes a case of, listen, who actually caused the damage? Especially if you're thinking according to Rav Yochanan. Why? Because what you're actually saying here is as follows, is you're saying that at the end of the day, that the person who had the coals left his coals unattended. Why was the dog able to take a biscuit if somebody was watching his coals? So therefore, the owner of the coals has to be partially responsible, especially even Rav Yochanan would have to agree if you consider the coals at which there's responsibility to as well with regards to the stack, because the piece of coal stuck on the biscuit, and therefore why doesn't the owner of the coal share culpability along with the person who owns the dog that created the fire of Tzoros from taking it from point A to B? So that's what the Gemara is asking. Why don't they share the costing involved? So the Gemara answers, the Mishnah refers to where he guarded his coal. So what does it mean? It means as follows, that at the end of the day, the owner of the coal basically left it inside his house with the doors properly latched. And he is also a victim of an unavoidable mishap, if this dog still got into his house and took the coal. This is according to Rashi, and he cannot be held liable. So let me just give you an example of a case here. I don't have the latest, what do you call it, baking oven, and Arthur's got a special coals at the bottom, and he's got a fan there because Arthur's quite handy, and he created a convection oven where the heat doesn't just burn stuff, but almost it allows for convection where the biscuits actually bake and raise. But as a single bachelor, I don't have that facility, so I brought my cookies along to cook in Arthur's oven, and that oven was going to take an hour. Okay, now generally that was in the kitchen, and I latched the door closed. And in those days, you didn't have concrete flooring. So what we're saying here is that Arthur took the necessary precautions as owner of the oven or the coal, etc., where the dog was kept out of harm's way, because Arthur knows that if you've got cats and dogs from experience in a kitchen, stuff is going to be consumed. So therefore, Arthur was diligent and he locked his door. In that particular case, Arthur is not responsible for the coals, and I'm responsible because of the actual biscuit I was baking. So what we're saying is here that there's a third party involved. So say, for example, Kevin's involved. Kev, say you've got a dog, right? So this is it. You've got a dog, and there's Shimon. Rabbi Cohen brings an example like this. There's Shimon, Levi, and Reuven. Okay, so I'd rather say Arthur, Kevin, and Damon and Gavin. Okay, so it's Arthur's oven. We're all getting together for a bride. Gavin's there, etc. I bring the biscuits. I come there. It's Arthur's oven, and you've brought your dog along. Okay. So Arthur's used to having his animals out of the kitchen, so he latches the door. In that particular case, your dog burrows under the flooring and gets to the coals and steals the biscuit from that point. So Arthur cannot be responsible for his coals, and therefore, if your dog consumed my food, you, Kevin, as the dog owner, would be responsible. Does that make sense? Because the owner of the coals there took the necessary precautions. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the Gemara. So what it's saying here is, according to the Gemara asked, but let the owner of the coal be liable for the paying of the stack as well, because he left his coal where the dog could get at it. So we're saying in this particular case, it's Gavin's haystack. Okay, and therefore Kevin, who owns the dog, is going to be responsible for that. And my biscuits were baking in Arthur's oven, and the kitchen was secure. Is that we're asking for Gavin's haystack? Okay? Who's responsible? Is it you that's responsible, Kevin, because it's your dog that caused it? And the Gemara is saying, yes, you are responsible in full. And what it's saying is, why isn't Arthur responsible? Because it's Arthur's coals. And one of his coals stuck onto my biscuit, which your dog stole from the bra. It ate my biscuit and set alight Gavin's haystack. So it's asking, why aren't both you, as the dog owner, responsible and Arthur responsible jointly? Because it was Arthur's fire that created the problem, and your dog that transported it, where your dog ate my biscuit, because my biscuits were cooking in Arthur's oven. So we all get together for a braai. Let's make it simple. We all get together for a braai. And what happens in that particular case is I bring the biscuits. It's Arthur's oven that's doing the cooking. You brought your dog for some unknown reason. Gavin's got his particular haystack there. Okay, so the Gemara is saying, Kevin, because it's your dog is responsible in full for eating my biscuit, and your dog is responsible in full for setting alight Gavin's haystack. And the Gemara is that actually anything. So it was saying that Arthur in this case, is not responsible because he made his coal safe. He hid it away. So since he hid his coal away, he's not responsible in any way. It says the Gemara states that the Mishnah refers to where Arthur guarded his coal. The Gemara asks if it refers to where he guarded his coal, what is the dog doing there? In other words, it's saying, how did the dog actually get to the coal? So what it's saying is, the Gemara is asking this question in terms is that it's bringing a case that Arthur is not liable for his fire because Arthur created simply locked his kitchen door and the food was cooking and the dog burrowed under the flooring to get to the biscuit on the fire. And therefore, Arthur had taken the right precaution and therefore is not responsible. So Kevin wants to say, why am I fully responsible for Damon's biscuit and I'm responsible for Gavin's stack of grain? Simply because we're living in a complex like Hazelwood, for example, and all our places are next to each other. So Kevin feels that Arthur's coal is also responsible, and he's saying, yes, if Arthur locked off his coal properly, then what is the biscuit, Damon's biscuit with a piece of coal, doing in my dog's mouth? Meaning, Arthur, how secure could you have locked the door if my dog ended up with the biscuit in the coal? That's the question that Kevin is asking of Arthur. You see that, Kev? That's what the Gemara is saying. So the answer is that the Mishnah refers to where the dog burrowed in the closed house. So the Gemara remarks, Rav Mari, the son of Rav Kahana, said, from the fact that the Mishnah obligates the dog's master to pay full damages for the biscuit, this teaches us that under ordinary circumstances, latch doors are burrowed through for a dog. Okay? Which means that a dog is capable of burrowing through something that would be ordinarily latched, whereas a person wouldn't have access to be able to burrow through. So then the next question which Kevin should be asking is, what? Does anybody know what sort of question Kevin should be asking? If I turn around and say, yes, Kevin has locked the door, but the dog is burrowed under the closed house. And apparently, if we look at Rav Mari, the son of Rav Kahana, it says, from the fact that the Mishnah obligates the dog's master to pay full damages for the biscuit, this teaches that under ordinary circumstances, latch doors are burrowed through for a dog. So if it's ordinary for a dog to burrow through things, and that's why Rav Mari says that's why Kevin's dog pays full damages for the biscuit that it took from me, and because it's Shorah's half payment damages for the stack, and Arthur isn't party to paying any of those costs, because it's normal for a dog to burrow. What do you think the obvious question is, guys? What's the obvious question? Guys?
Was what's his name, Arthur getting off the hook completely?
Yes, because you're saying if it's normal for a dog to burrow under flooring, then how could Arthur consider it sufficient to just lock his kitchen door? If a dog's normal behavior, according to Rav Mari, is saying that you pay full damages for the biscuit, right? Is a case of shame. Now, what I'm saying is, if it's unusual for a dog to burrow, which is keren tam, Kevin should only be paying half payment damages for the biscuit. The very fact that Kevin is paying full damages and it goes under the category of shame means it's a normal way for an animal to go through is to burrow. And therefore, since it's normal for an animal to burrow through, then how can it consider that Arthur has looked after his coals by simply locking the door? Since this is normal behavior. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So what am I saying? Kevin, Arthur, can any of you answer? Why is everything frozen?
I can still see you.
I can still see you.
Okay.
No, it's fine. You see you.
All right.
Everything's okay.
So the answer is as follows, is that So the question is, it's not unusual for a dog to tunnel its way under a latch door. So if it was unusual, then the dog's master would only pay half damages for the biscuit, since the dog will have attained it through an act of caring time. Okay. This is from the Meromei Sodeh. This is the question. Since the Mishnah rules that the master pays full damages for the biscuit and is classified under shame, we see that the dog's tunneling under the door is deemed to be a normal act. So the question is, how could it be seen that since it's a normal act for a dog to burrow, that Arthur locking the doors would be sufficient? So the answer to this, according to Tosfot, is that if it's usual for dogs to tunnel the way into closed houses, then how can the Gemara say that the owner of the house has properly guarded his coal by latching the door to his house? In the final analysis, he has left the coal in a place where it is accessible to dogs. So Tosfot answers his question and says, Tosfot's answer is that since a person has taken all the usual precautions that people take to guard their coals, the rabbis did not require him to employ further measures. And if the normal precautions prove inadequate, then he is considered to be the victim of an unavoidable mishap. Okay? So what we're saying here is what is deemed a normal precaution is what prevents a person from being able to gain access to that room. So for example, if Arthur locks the doors to his kitchen where he's baking the biscuit, and I as a person don't have the capacity to burrow under flooring, then that is deemed taking a secure precaution. Because if it's deemed a precaution for humans, Tosfot said it's acceptable. Does that make sense? And therefore, since Arthur took the necessary precautions, Kevin is responsible for not watching his dog and allowing his dog out of his sight. Let's go on. All right. So it says, the Gemara inquires further into the circumstances of the Mishnah's case. Now, the Mishnah means that the dog ate the biscuit where? If it means to say that the dog ate the biscuit at an outsider stack, in other words, the stack belonging to someone other than the owner of the biscuit, then why does the dog's master pay for the biscuit? Why? In order for one to be liable for shame, we need the fulfillment of the condition, and it consumes in the field of another, which is in Shmot chapter 22, verse 4. And it's lacking in this case. So the Gemara answers, no, it's necessary to say that the Mishnah refers to where the dog ate the biscuit at the stack of the owner of the biscuit. So let me explain to you what we're saying here. Is that the dog, if the dog eats the biscuit in any place other than the premises of the biscuit owner, the dog's master should not be liable to pay for the biscuit at all. Okay? So we're having here a situation where Gavin now is involved, right? So what happens is Gavin lives next door, Kevin, Arthur, and myself. And Kevin's dog ended up burrowing under Arthur's flooring where he's got the coals, took my biscuits, and then placed for a braai. Okay? And since I went into Arthur's place for a braai, if it never ate it in my property, the biscuit, then Kevin isn't responsible for paying for the biscuit because it has to eat in the field of the damaged party. So it's asking, where did it eat the biscuit? So even though I want repayment back for my food eaten, if it didn't eat in my premises, in other words, Shane is always when your animal escapes and eats in my field. And when your animal escapes and eats in my field, it's responsible for that sort of payment because you have no reason to be there. So here it's asking the question, but you're not liable if Kevin is not liable if his dog ate my biscuits in Arthur's premises. Does that make sense, guys? So that's why it's asking this particular question, because the condition has to be fulfilled that it's eating in the field of the damaged party. So the Gemara clearly implies that had the dog eaten the biscuit outside the premises of the biscuit owner, its master would not be liable to pay for the biscuit. Okay. Tosfot had this discussion in 20a. You remember from the previous daf, it proves that from here, when deciding whether or not a situation is one of shame in a damaged party's yard, we look at the place in which the animal actually eats the food, not the place from which it takes the food. And according to Tosfot, he rejects Rashi's explanation that Rav Zera's inquiry concerning rolling. So it involves precisely this question of whether we follow the place from where the animal actually took the food or the place in which it ate it. I don't know if you remember the previous daf, Gavin. We learned that an animal. Do you remember asparagais? Remember that long sort of grape that the animal started eating in one domain, and it grew, for example, from the private domain and had parts sticking out in the public domain, or it had parts in the private domain, but it grew in the public domain. And we learned in the previous daf, where's the animal responsible for the food? It extends out to another. That was the.
Damon, can you just repeat? You broke up. That froze for about 15 seconds there. I missed. Can you just repeat the point, please?
So what it's saying here is what we're actually learning from this particular daf, in the 23rd daf. When we were learning on the 20th daf, where's the animal responsible for shame? Where the animal actually eats the food or where it takes the food from? So in other words, if it takes the food from my private domain but eats it in the public domain, is it responsible because it takes it from the private domain at the point at which it takes it? Or is it responsible from the point at which it consumes it? It actually eats the food. So that was the daf that we discussed in the 20th daf. And the 23rd daf, this is Tosfot's proof to say that it's actually where the animal eats the food. Because in order for you to be liable for your dog paying for my biscuits, it can't eat it if I'm baking the biscuits in Arthur's house. Because even if Arthur didn't guard his coals properly, you have to consume, your animal has to consume it in the private domain of whoever owns that food. And does that make sense? So that's where we have to learn this particular principle. So it's going onto a discussion, and it's going, because it says the owner of the biscuit went to bake it in someone else's oven. Accordingly, the dog did not take it from the premises of the biscuit owner. Okay? So we're learning as follows. The Gemara considers deriving a principle from the ruling of the Mishnah. Conclude on the basis of this Mishnah that the mouth of the cow, who is the damaged party's yard, who's in the damaged party's yard, is treated as the damaged party's yard. Okay? So if it's treated as the damager's yard, then why does the Mishnah rule that the master pays for the biscuit that his dog has eaten? Let the master of the dog say to the owner of the biscuit, what is your bread in the mouth of my dog? So that's basically a rhetorical way of saying that the biscuit has been eaten on the damager's premises, and you're not liable to pay. So, for example, if for example, I could turn around to you and say, listen, Kevin, you're responsible for paying for my biscuit. And I come to your place and I see your dog eating my food on your premises. And I say, you're responsible because your dog ate my food. And you would turn around to me and was saying, well, what's your food doing in my dog's mouth? Meaning my dog's not at your premises. My dog's on my premises. If you're dozy enough to allow your dog, my dog, to eat at your premises and you're not watching properly and it's eating it at my premises, how's that my fault? It's not a case where you caught my dog in your premises trespassing. So if it's seen as the damaged party's yard, the mouth of the dog, then you're responsible. In other words, you've trespassed to me. So it's the same sort of case as we're saying with Keren Tam. You bring your chihuahua to me and you come to my premises without permission, and I've got a Doberman. And now my Doberman kills your dog, and you want reparation damages for your Chihuahua, I'm going to say, what is your dog doing on my premises without permission? It's the same thing that if my food is in your dog's mouth, and I come to you and say, on your premises, my food is in your dog's mouth, you're going to say, what is your food doing in my dog's mouth? In other words, what does it have to do with me? You never caught my dog on your premises, so it wasn't trespassing. You were negligent. You should never have allowed your stuff to be unmanaged and unguarded. So that's the principle that we're learning at the moment, okay? So basically, if a cow stands in the yard of the damaged party, but her mouth is owned by a master, the Gemara will inquire presently whether we view a cow that eats while standing in the damaged party's yard as a case of shame, since that's where she stands to eat her food, or in her own master's yard, because that's where she took it in terms of premises. So all we're doing now is we're repeating it in a very convoluted way, which Tosfot explained in a very simple way, which he said is, listen, you've got to see where the animal eats the food. It doesn't matter where it took the food from. If it ate the food, if Kevin's dog ate my food in Kevin's yard, Kevin is not responsible. If Kevin's dog ate the food belonging to me in my premises, Kevin is responsible. Does that make sense? That's all the principle is trying to show. Okay. So I think what we're going to do is we're just going to end off on this note, and then we're going to continue this part of the daf tomorrow. Is there any other question?
So the bottom line is, if the dog eats it on the premises of the private at the private residence, then the owner of the dog is liable. It's not up to the owner of the private domain to be cautious.
So we learned three principles.
In the case of the dogs killing the dogs.
So we learned three principles. Number one is that Arthur would be culpable if he allowed open access to animals or people to a damager, which is a fire. So if basically you had a primary stove cooking food with hot oil and Arthur never latched the door and a child burnt himself, Arthur's responsible. If Arthur did a reasonable precaution and locked the kitchen and the kid somehow crawled through the window and then found some food and knocked hot oil over himself, Arthur is not responsible. Also saying that Arthur is not responsible if he took reasonable precautions which would prevent human access, and just because a dog burrows doesn't mean that Arthur has to suddenly build concrete flooring. It's your responsibility, Kevin, as the dog owner, to also watch your dog. If Arthur took reasonable precautions, and then in order for you to be responsible for the biscuit, that biscuit would have to be eaten on my premises. So if I'm baking my biscuits at Arthur's premises, you're not responsible for paying for biscuits on Arthur's premises. It's only if the biscuit owner's premises is where the biscuits are eaten, because that can be proven that your animal came into my premises and ate vegetables or whatever it was in the damaged party's yard. That has to fulfill the definition of Shmot chapter 22 verse 4. That's what it's saying. And Tosfot learns from there that if an animal takes it from the damaged party's yard but eats it in the damager's yard, the damager is not responsible. That's all we've learned so far. Okay,
that was actually very good. Nice and concise.
Yeah, concise. I want to share like my heart, short. Okay.
But good looking.
Thanks, Whit. It's lovely to see you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Hey guys, thanks.
Cheers.
Yeah, likewise. Guys, everybody have a good day. Thanks, Damon.
Thanks for attending.
Cheers.
Okay, ciao, guys.